Welcome to Ask the Expert. Today's question is from Alan. Alan wants to know a bit about digital and passive crossover networks. So, Alan asks, how much with your experience would be gained using the same amplifiers and DAC, but replacing the passive crossover with its losses and nonlinearity with a digital filter? So, slightly loaded question. But if we start by describing the difference between a digital crossover and a passive crossover. So in a passive crossover, you drive a traditional loudspeaker from an amplifier, and then inside the speaker, you divide the signal between each of the drivers with the signal coming from the amplifier. So you have passive components like resistors, capacitors, inductors to divide that signal into each of the drivers. In the digital crossover, you do the crossover before the amplifiers. So you take the small signal, divide the signal into each driver, and then you have an amplifier for each driver. And so it's a different approach, and that's what you typically do in active loudspeakers. Let's talk a little bit about what are the benefits of doing a digital crossover. I'll start by saying that in an optimal design, you would actually make a lot of different decisions based on, are you making a passive speaker or are you making a digital speaker? So the best digital loudspeaker is not simply replacing what was passive before with an active system. You might optimize things differently. But for the sake of this discussion, let's assume you are using the same basis for all of this. So what are the benefits of a digital crossover? One of the benefits you get in acoustic terms is if you have better control over phase and time. So you can not only divide the frequency for each driver, you can also shift them in time. And that can help you a lot in optimizing the coherence between the drivers and what reaches your ear, so to say. You also have a lot of other more advanced possibilities where you can optimize the signal in lots of ways without adding a longer signal path. So in a passive crossover, if you want to have a more advanced control over each driver, you want to have finer adjustments, you're adding components every time you're adding a filter, every time you're adding another step of change, then you are adding a component. You don't do that in a digital filter. You can do whatever you want with the same amount of components with the same signal path. A digital crossover is also immune to voice coil power compression. When you are driving a loudspeaker, as you are heating up the voice coil, the response of the voice coil actually changes. So you have a different electrical property of the voice coil. And the voice coil is actually part of the calculation of a passive crossover. So when you are playing louder, the crossover actually changes a little bit. So the crossover doesn't work the same when you're playing low volume and high volume. And with a digital crossover, you don't have that problem. So you can alleviate that issue. That also is an advantage of the digital crossover. You have other things you can do that is not directly related to the crossover part, but you can do driver protection, for instance. You can do frequency extension when you're not playing loud. You can play at deeper frequencies, for instance. You can't really do that with a passive crossover. It's also more efficient because you don't have all of these passive components between the amplifier and the driver. You are using more of the power to actually drive the loudspeaker driver with less heat loss in those passive components. And lastly, and maybe most surprisingly, a digital crossover can actually be cheaper than a passive crossover. If you look at the crossover itself, the passive components can be quite expensive if you want to do a high quality passive crossover. A digital crossover can be done very cheaply. The downside to that is now you have an amplifier for each of the drivers. So if you look at the total system, it might not be cheaper. But the crossover itself is typically actually cheaper in the active loudspeaker. With all of these advantages, what are the downsides? Why do we still use passive crossovers in Analogue speakers? Well, there are some reasons for this. One of them is the digital crossover can be more complex to design. There are a lot of considerations you have to take. It generally requires a fixed amplifier choice. So if you want to do this properly, you're locking yourself down to one specific amplifier and a complete closed system, because if you don't know what amplifier you're connecting to the loudspeaker driver, you can't really optimize the crossover. It's possible to do a separate outboard digital crossover where you can decide the amplifier, but then you are losing a lot of these advantages that we just talked about, because you don't know what the whole system will be. So you will have less flexibility. In the passive speaker, you are more open to fine-tuning and changing a lot of things in the system, where the active system will be more closed down. So what we see in the real world is very often the result from changing from passive to active is the sound will be different. And one thing you have to realize is that you can't really just take a passive loudspeaker and replace that crossover network with a digital one with the exact same properties. That will not work because of the way passive components work together with the speaker drivers. If you take away that part of the system, when you have the digital crossover, you don't have the interaction between the crossover and the driver. You just have a clear crossover by itself that needs to work through this signal path. Then the result will not be the same. So you have to still optimize specifically for now you have a digital system. So the end result, no matter what you do, it will never sound exactly the same, but better. It will be in some ways just different. As an example, if you put a tweeter directly in front of an amplifier with no components in between, you might have a higher noise ratio in the tweeter, where in a passive network you will have a resistor in front of the tweeter typically, which actually helps in reducing noise from the amplifiers. Just one example of the interaction between the drivers and crossover networks is just different. So the conclusion to all of this is basically you have a potential for better performance if you do a digital crossover, but it's not a guarantee. You still have to fine-tune it properly.